So welcome everyone, and I'm really excited to be here this evening. I am coming to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Petun, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And this has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years. And it's the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a sacred agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. In terms of questions for this evening, please use the Q&A feature. The chat is open, so you can chat with each other, but just so that the presenters see the questions, try to put those into the Q&A, please, and you can do that at any time. So as people are speaking, feel free to put your questions in there and we'll get to them at the end. So I was asked to say a few words, first of all, about Canadian Friends Service Committee and why we're hosting this event and who I am. So I'm the Peace Program Coordinator of Canadian Friends Service Committee. It's our 90th anniversary this year, and we are the National Peace and Social Justice Agency of the Religious Society of Friends, better known as Quakers, in Canada. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity with CFSC to write a book called Are We Done Fighting? Building Understanding in a World of Hate and Division. And part of the research that I did in that book was looking at issues of peace and how they're so interrelated with issues of justice, and you really can't have positive peace without having ways to non-violently change systems. And so I think we're going to learn a lot about those ways, and also hear some direct stories that will inspire us and some tips for action tonight. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and it ties into areas that I've heard so many amazing stories from different Quakers and others. And oftentimes we don't get to hear those stories told. And so I think that there's a lot of wisdom there that doesn't necessarily get shared broadly enough. And so I think there's also a lot of misunderstandings about what nonviolence is, especially because of how protest actions are covered by the media and the kind of shallow ways that we often think about power. And so I'm really looking forward to this session. I hope that you all are too. And so with that, I will do the speaker introductions. Rivera Sun is a change maker, a cultural creative, a protest novelist, and an advocate for nonviolence and social justice. She's the author of the Dandelion Insurrection, The Way Between, and other novels, as well as the editor of Nonviolence News. Her study guide to making change with nonviolent action is used by activist groups across the United States and around the world. Rivera is the program's coordinator for Campaign Nonviolence and serves on the advisory board of World Beyond War. Rivera attended the James Lawson Institute in 2014 and facilitates workshops in strategy for nonviolent change across the US and internationally. Between 2012 to 2017, she co-hosted nationally 2 syndicated radio programs on civil resistance strategies and campaigns. In all of her work, she connects the dots between the issues, shares solutionary ideas, and inspires people to step up to the challenge of being a part of the story of change in our times. Ruth Walmsley is a member of Vancouver Monthly Meeting and has served as Canadian Yearly Meeting representative on the KAIROS Ecological Justice Circle for the past 6 years. She's an activist and community organizer for social and environmental justice. In 2012, she co-founded BROKE, Burnaby Residents Opposing Kinder Morgan Expansion. Since August 2020, she has been working with Protect the Planet, Stop TMX, to stop construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline in the Vancouver area. Rachel Small from World Beyond War and the No Fighter Jets campaign is a community organizer based in Toronto. And she has organized within local and international social and environmental justice movements for over a decade, with a special focus on working in solidarity with communities harmed by Canadian extractive industry projects in Latin America. She's also worked on campaigns and mobilizations around climate justice, decolonization, anti-racism, disability justice, and food sovereignty. Rachel joins us today to talk about the No Fighter Jets campaign. So we will start with a presentation from Rivera.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thanks to everyone for hosting this really important gathering, this really important session on these tools that have really come down to us through a lineage that stretches around the globe, that encompasses people on every continent, that includes people of every gender, ethnicity, race, religion, class, background, political persuasion. The lineage of what I call nonviolent action is truly one of the greatest achievements of humanity to date. And I hope to share some of the stories that really illuminates what makes us feel so powerful. But as we talk about these stories, I want to just remind us and take a moment to acknowledge that what we're talking about today is not just an abstract, it's not just in a historical sense, it's also happening right now in so many places across Canada, across the US, around the world. But let's just, I want to bring your attention to the struggle that's going on right now at Wet, Sweat and Land to stop the Coastal GasLink pipeline. They were just rated by the RCMP for that what we're talking about is a lived experience for them and their allies at this moment, and for so many others. And the reason we study this field is so that we can become better allies and better organizers, so that we are working in a time of great change to support great change that is oftentimes long overdue. So Rachel Small is going to speak a little bit more about what's going on at Wet, Sweat and Land a little later in today's program, but I just want to bring it really relevant, really present, like now, right now. This is what we're talking about. So tonight's event is called Tales of Peaceful Protest. So I actually want to start right there with the title and that word, peaceful protest. So this is a word that kicked around for decades, but became very popular in the media and with the politicians during the George Floyd protests. And it was used both by the movements and by power holders. And each of them used it in a different way. The movements used it to try to describe nonviolent action without saying the word nonviolent. And the power holders tried to use it in a weaponized fashion to say, you're not being peaceful enough, or you're not being peaceful enough, or please be peaceful and don't rock the boat, right? So just to start with, I want to just bring up Dr. King's concept of negative and positive peace. And this is something that Matt just spoke about. The reason we need to talk about this is because we're really used to negative peace. Negative peace is everywhere in our world. Negative peace is the absence of physical violence, forms of violence. It looks like when your community is really peaceful and the lawns are all mowed and, everybody's walking their dog on a leash and picking up the poop and all of that. Everybody's behaving really nicely. But at the same time, our world and our lives are built upon unpaid labor, sweatshop conditions. They only can proceed in this negative peace by ignoring things like people of color being killed by the police, or the fact that we're destroying our planet and violating native sovereignty in order to get our fossil fuels that power our machinery and our homes and turn the lights on. So negative peace is when things are peaceful on the surface, but they're roiling with injustice underneath. And when politicians or power holders call for peaceful protests, they often mean quiet down and accept the injustice. This is not acceptable for those of us who want to see justice in the world. This is a picture from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Brazil. And this is a great example of negative peace. So the people on the right hand of the screen have this really peaceful sort of existence. They've got their swimming pools, they've got their tennis courts, but their wealth and their privilege is built on the fact of the enforced poverty of millions of people. And that is a form of negative peace. So we're always striving towards positive peace, a peace rooted in justice. And again, this is a phrase that comes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Kingian nonviolence tradition. And this is not just arriving at the destination of a peace rooted in justice, it's also the process of getting there. And shifting from a negative peace to a positive peace rarely feels peaceful. It often feels unsettling, uncomfortable, dangerous, scary, frightening, loud, obnoxious. But a movement that's moving towards positive peace is more peaceful, even if it doesn't feel that way, than a society built on negative peace. So, for example, during the George Floyd protests, people tore down statues of slave owners, and in this case, threw it in the river. And, many people got very upset about this and said, oh, that's not peaceful protest. I would argue that regardless of how we feel about property destruction, the spirit of this gathering was largely a peaceful protest, and it was rooted in that pursuit of positive peace. And what came afterwards actually was a very powerful example of positive peace. So in the place of the statue that was torn down, this statue was first put up actually totally off the cuff without legal permission. And then later on, the politicians scrambled and actually said, oh yes, that could stay. So this is an example of a peace rooted in justice. So I hope that helps to tease apart this idea of what do we mean by peaceful protest. We're not looking for that negative peace. We're looking for that positive peace, even if it feels in the moment like nothing we would describe as peace, quote unquote. So in pursuit of this, we're going to use a lot of tools and tactics, and that's what I want to talk about next. I want to talk about the tools of nonviolent action as the tools, the literal things like a hammer or a screwdriver that we use to build and construct a peace rooted in justice. And when we look at these tools, we also are going to look at them in three major categories. And the reason it's important to think about categories is because there's over 300 different methods of nonviolent action. And we want to break those down so that we understand how nonviolent action can achieve the justice that we're seeking. Nonviolent action can range from things like dancing in the streets and using music to de-escalate the threat of violence at the US election polls that happened in 2020. It can look like Buddhist monks ordaining trees as monks to stop clear cutting in Cambodia. But if we look at the three major categories, let's start with acts of protest and persuasion. This is a large category, and we're often really familiar with it. You can see actually in this photo a number of tactics. We see signs, we see t-shirts, we see the holding of symbolic flowers. We see a couple of people walking around with cameras to document the demonstration. We see people rallying, perhaps standing in silent vigil, and in a few moments they may be chanting. These are all forms of protest and persuasion. But it doesn't just have to look like the same old marches or demonstrations. For example, in Thailand in 2020, when pro-democracy protesters were being met with water cannons, they decided they would bring these giant inflatable ducks to the demonstrations. And they ended up being able to lift those up as shields to block and stop the water cannons. Increasingly, what we see is that on the streets and in-person actions are combined with digital actions, digital acts of protest and persuasion. So in this case in Florida in 2021, they conducted a over 100-mile ceremonial prayer walk to protect this Everglades lake. But they combined that with, let's go back, with the holding of a sign and this hashtag, defend the sacred, taking photos and putting them online. So even though there may not have been a lot of people outside of the marchers bearing witness to or seeing this particular ceremony, thousands of people saw it when they posted it on social media. Oftentimes, acts of protest and persuasion alone are not enough to achieve justice, because we know that change happens not just when we shout loud enough, right? Matt was saying, we have to really rethink how we're thinking about power. And I don't know about Canada, you'll have to tell me later on in today's session, but in the US, we have this really bad habit where we start to say, if we just shout loud enough, change will happen. And that's our theory of change, even though we're proved wrong on that over and over again. What we know from nonviolent struggle is that change starts to happen when we withdraw our consent and cooperation from either the injustice that we're opposing or from business as usual. And we disrupt the status quo to the point where the power holder must deal with the disruption that our movements engendered. And this doesn't just mean that it's disruption for disruption's sake. It could be targeted, it could be strategic. In the case of the school strikes that the youth have been doing, they are withdrawing their cooperation and consent from education as usual and calling up the moral question of what kind of a future are we preparing for? And as you can see, they're using a number of acts of protest and persuasion in addition to going on strike from school. Non-cooperation can also happen across sectors. So you can, in Argentina, for example, it wasn't just the factory workers in the vegetable oil industry that went on strike. They also asked the truck drivers that would move the barrels of vegetable oil from the factory to the docks to go on strike. They asked the dock workers to go on strike, and they asked the workers on the ships to go on strike. They asked the administrators to go on strike. And because they worked across their industry with every single person who did anything to move a barrel of oil, they won a 1/3, again, increase in their wages for 30,000 people. One of the powers of nonviolent action is to not do it alone and to work with as many other people as possible. That's not to say that working alone can't be powerful. Individual acts of non-cooperation at strategic moments can be extremely well-timed to challenge a grave injustice. This Maori lawmaker in New Zealand was actually thrown out of their parliament for refusing to wear a tie, and that was in the dress code. And he called it the colonial noose. And he rightly identified that the dress code of their parliament was rooted in colonialist values. So he walked out. Well, actually, he was thrown out. And in the media storm that followed, the lawmakers repealed the dress code and dismantled that piece of colonialism. One of the things about non-cooperation to remember is that many times acts of non-cooperation are hard to see, right? When we withdraw our consent and support our participation in the system, sometimes it looks like the Haitian judges going on strike. All you see is closed doors and empty buildings. That's why we want to actually combine it with acts of protest and persuasion to make visible what we are doing. The third category of nonviolent action is acts of intervention. And this is when we physically get in the way of either injustice as usual or business as usual. Acts of intervention can take a lot of different forms. They can be more constructive or prefigurative in nature. They can look like defying unjust laws to do things like rescue migrants at sea. But again, we want our actions to disrupt the things that are going on so that the power holders have to pay attention. Disruptive action doesn't just have to be overt. like, putting a pink boat in the middle of an intersection, for example, is very overt, it's very visible. It can also be covert. In Myanmar, as they were resisting the coup, it was illegal to hold marches, it was illegal to hold demonstrations, it was illegal to shut down roads. So what they started to do was they would just drop these onions in a crosswalk, and they would slowly pick them up, and as soon as they almost had them picked up, someone else would drop another bag. And what this meant was that effectively the entire city started to be shut down and traffic ground to a halt. And everyone knew that this kind of disruption was part of the resistance to the coup. But it was hard for the police to say, oh, we're going to arrest you for dropping onions in the street. And to stop all the variations of this, for example, you can no longer drop onions in the street is a law. And then they're like, oh, how about oranges? What about bananas? Oh, look, there's a flash mob happening in the street. If we can be disruptive, we can also be constructive. And so this is the other half of nonviolent struggle, is constructing the new world. The mutual aid networks that exploded across the US, and I imagine Canada had a similar phenomenon happen during COVID-19, are a good example of people dismantling classism and taking care of one another and constructing a direct challenge to the lack of relief and aid that the federal government was not supplying. But constructive actions and prefigurative actions can also look like the Camden New Journal running a whole issue from the future. So this is actually from January 7th, 2030. And it is full of articles and stories and even advertisements from what Camden in the UK would look like once they had made their climate transition. Meanwhile, another form of direct action that is also prefigurative is saying things like the Oakland Moms for Housing, who said, look, there's an empty house. Instead of letting people just upsell this to gentrifiers, let's actually unlock the door, move in, and show that this house could remain in the community as community housing. In the course of this struggle, they did indeed secure this house and several others in Oakland for community housing, and then they inspired similar campaigns in Philadelphia and LA. Alternative institutions are also another form of nonviolent action. For example, in Syria, rebel librarians went and gathered books from the city, which was under siege and under attack and being bombed, and they built a literal underground library that provided a respite from the grind of war that they were experiencing. So there's just a few other points about nonviolent action that I think are really important if we want to be strategic about our work. One is to understand the difference between concentrated actions and dispersed actions. Concentrated actions are when we put our bodies all in one place together. For example, the India farmer protests that had lots of sit-ins and demonstrations and marches and ultimately involved 250 million people in the world's largest act of nonviolent action in human history. Just for reference, the US population is about 250 million people. I can't imagine all of us doing what they did in India. I would love to see it, but it's hard to imagine. Here's a little shout out to my friends at World Beyond War and Canadian peace activists. Concentrated actions are also blockading weapons trucks, getting in the way of the problem or the injustice that we're opposing. You have to put your body physically in the same space. Another example are these Inuit hunters who actually drove on snowmobile for 2 days to blockade a mining site in negative 30 degrees Celsius weather. Very impressive. But the converse is dispersed actions. And this is when instead of filling the street, you empty the street. And there are a lot of reasons why you might need to do this or why you might need to know the difference between these tactics. Usually when you shift to dispersed actions, it's because you're facing some form of threat, danger, or repression. And, in the past couple of years, we've had so many that we need to acknowledge. The pandemic, for example, police brutality, counter-protester violence. Dispersed tactics help you keep organizing when the going gets tough. So the sick out strike by school teachers actually forced the Columbus, Ohio school district to stop a hasty school reopening that was happening early in the pandemic. It could also look like stand-in art, as in this climate action in Turkey, where people aren't holding those signs, sculpture is holding those signs. This is one of the most provocative and galvanizing dispersed actions that's happened in the US in recent years. This was the sculpture that actually prompted the whole No Kids in Cages campaign that really raised the issue of migrant family separation and migrant detentions. Things like street murals have been on the rise, and car caravans. I could go on with a number of these, but I'm going to stop my screen just for a minute. So I hope this gives you a sense of how versatile the toolbox of nonviolent action is, and how usually we're only scraping the surface of what this toolbox is all about. It's really important that you dig deeper into the toolbox, because when we always use strength as organizers, one of the things that we now know about nonviolent struggle comes out of the groundbreaking work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who in 2012, I believe, looked at 326 case studies of both nonviolent struggles and violent struggles, comparing them. And they found that not only is nonviolent action working, it's actually working twice as often as violence, in a third of the amount of time, and with 1/10 of the casualties. So this actually upends all of the misperceptions about nonviolence, and we hear them all the time. We hear nonviolence is ineffective, it won't work. Nonviolence, it takes too long, it's too slow. Nonviolence, well, everybody's just going to get massacred, right? The data on struggles shows that nonviolence is twice as effective, it works faster than violence, and you're far less likely to be killed in the context of a nonviolent struggle than you are if you choose to use violence to wage your struggle. So this is really powerful information, and we're just at a point where we all need to know this information. We need to know what nonviolent action is and how it works and why it works. To me, it's actually then know how to drive. For example, you can catch a ride with a friend, but when it's time to wage a struggle, you got to know this stuff. And when we live in times like these, where change is not an option, it's not optional, we know that we must change. We know that the entrenched systems that we face must be challenged and overturned. We know that the threats to our communities are grave enough that they are all existential and must be resisted. We need to know this material. So I'm going to share just one more piece of knowledge, and you've all been so wonderful listening to all this, absorbing it, taking it in. I'm sure somebody's out there taking notes, so thank you. And I just want to give you a framework in which to see the kind of architecture or the blueprints of making change, not just the hammer and the screwdriver. Okay. So if you want to find more examples of struggles that are happening, I do encourage you to check out Nonviolence News. A lot of the images and slides and stories that I shared came from Nonviolence News. So tactics alone do not a movement make. Let's just repeat that. Tactics alone do not a movement make. You want to think of the building blocks of change. So nonviolent actions are kind of like the grains of sand that make up the blocks that we can build a staircase for making change with. And what you really want to get into is this idea of a campaign. Campaigns use many types of actions, many tactics, and they chip away at those broad goals that we might have as organizers. For example, I want world peace. I mean, doesn't everybody, right? I want world peace, but I need to break that down. I need to stop the fighter jets that Canada is trying to roll out. I need to stop the US's insane war budget. I need to stop military recruitment in schools. These are all examples of campaigns, base closures, ending weapons sales. Those are all campaigns towards the goals of world peace. And it breaks it down and makes it a little bit more manageable, and it gives us a pathway to make change. For example, if we look at the civil rights movement, or as some of the organizers who were alive at that time and are still alive like to call it, the American Freedom Movement, there were hundreds of campaigns to dismantle segregation in the United States. And they range from things like the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened in 1956 and was actually an early campaign, to the Nashville sit-ins. If we look at the Nashville sit-ins in 1960, they were the prototype for about 10 or 13 other sit-in campaigns in Raleigh and Durham and Charlotte that happened the very next year, in some cases, not even a full year later. If we look at something like the Freedom Riders of 1961, they actually drew inspiration from a action that Bayard Rustin had organized. I think it was in like 1945, so early. So all of these have different tactics and actions that they use to make up their campaigns. In the Nashville sit-ins, they had the sit-ins, but they also had a boycott of downtown stores. They had picket lines. They had rallies and marches and gatherings. All of these helped to make that campaign a success. So I just want to invite us to look just a little more carefully at the anatomy of a campaign. Campaigns have aims and objectives. They have targets. Who are they pressuring? What are they pressuring? They have a strategy to achieve that goal. They have participants, people who are going to be part of it. And we're going to look at some of these other things on the list as we go on. So your campaign needs to have an objective. What are you trying to accomplish? It needs to be pretty achievable, right? Again, not world peace. That might be your aim of your movement, but your objective is going to be something more specific and achievable. You're going to have a target or a focus. So who is the decision maker who you're trying to get shifted? What is the policy that needs to change? You're going to have a strategy. Again, how are you going to achieve your goal? What's your theory of change? And then participants, not just who are going to be the key people, the frontline activists, people are going to, lock down to the pipeline, but who are the support team for that? Who are the ally groups that you're going to call upon? For example, we talked about the problem of migrant family separation and migrant detention. A key ally group were actually the survivors of the concentration camps that the US put Japanese Americans into during World War II. They stood up and unequivocally said it was wrong then, it's wrong now, this needs to stop. And it really threw a moral quandary up in people's faces in a way that it was recontextualized the struggle. You want to think about your timing a little bit, and this may be one of our biggest failings as movements. When are we going to start our campaigns and when are they going to end? So Occupy Wall Street, I was part of that, so I can pick on it a little bit. It was a little crazy to launch an outdoor occupation campaign in September in North America. That was already destined to run into some severe weather challenges in just a couple months. So think about when you're starting and what are the things that you're going to reflect on. Think about how long your campaign is going to last. The Montgomery bus boycott was a 9-month campaign. They had to create a taxi service to sustain that boycott of the buses. What do you need to sustain your campaign? And why and when would you stop? You got to think about your messaging, your slogans. How are you going to convey the changes that you need? And then think about your tactics. You may be surprised that this is coming at this point in the conversation, but too often we pick a tactic and we design our whole campaign around that instead of saying, what are our goals? What are our strategy? And then how can the tools of nonviolent action help us build towards that goal? There are other things you can think about, how you're going to organize your group, what kind of risks you might face, and a number of other things, but that's enough for tonight. What I really hope to give you is a sense of the kind of thoughtfulness that you can put into the work that you're doing for change. It does just not just have to be willy-nilly. It doesn't just have to be the same old protests or marches. And indeed, thinking about your campaign is really going to be critical for being effective change makers. So I thank you so much for listening to me. This is the kind of stuff that I teach all over. I'm really honored to get to share this knowledge. It is not my knowledge. I did not invent this stuff. Again, this comes from this lineage of nonviolence that stretches around the world. And we know the names of Gandhi and King and Cesar Chavez, but I hope the images and the examples that I brought up in the slide help to remind us of who really built this field, these tools that we draw upon, and to honor them in our hearts as we work for change, to honor their sacrifices and their struggles that have shaped the world that we live in today by learning from what they wrestled with in their campaigns and being wise and skillful and strategic in the work that we are doing. So thank you so much. I appreciate this time, and I'm going to pass the mic over to my fellow.
Thanks very much. That really set the stage super well for us to talk about and hear the stories of Ruth, and then we'll hear from Rachel, but I'll pass it over to Ruth now. You're muted, Ruth. Ruth, you're muted.
Sorry about that, yes. I just said thank you so much, Rivera, for that inspiring overview of nonviolent civil disobedience and the historical context. And it was really, was wonderful to see the examples from all over the world. I'm really happy to be joining you tonight from my home in Burnaby, on the unceded and stolen lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish and Musqueam First Nations. Yeah, so the stories I'd like to share with you tonight, I'm just going to ask Kira to put up the first slide. Are coming more from my own personal experience, my own personal stories of peaceful protest. As Matt said, I'm a Quaker. I'm a mother of 2 adult children. I'm a community organizer and a land and water defender. My deep concern for social and environmental justice has been a theme throughout my life. I was born and raised in Toronto, and one of my first experiences of environmental activism dates back to 1976 when I was 16 years old. And I helped to organize a bicycle pilgrimage to the Pickering nuclear power plant. And we called ourselves Peaceful Peddlers Protesting Proliferation of Poisonous Power Plants. So there is much to say about the many different forms of peaceful public protest and direct action. And we've had a good sense of that from Rivera's presentation. And in this talk, I'll mostly be focusing on my own personal experience with nonviolent civil disobedience, which is a form of direct action which involves intentionally breaking a law, which is unjust and causing harm. and being willing to accept the consequences resulting from taking that action. Gandhi and others used the term passive resistance, but we know that nonviolent civil disobedience is the opposite of passive. It is a call to conscience and prophetic witness. It is intended to expose the violence in a situation and to challenge the legitimacy of the systems of power which perpetuate that violence. Quakers also have a history of nonviolent civil disobedience dating back to the beginnings of our faith. In the mid-1600s, when the Church of England outlawed any other form of worship, Quakers held true to their convictions and continued to engage in meetings for worship in the simple tradition of gathering in silence, during which anyone could minister as they felt led. And many Quakers were arrested and thrown in prison as a result of breaking that law. And there are wonderful stories of how the children continued to hold meetings for worship on their own during those years of persecution in England when all of their elders were in prison. Next slide. My first experience with nonviolent civil disobedience was in 1993 as part of the historic movement to protect old growth forests from being clear cut in Clayoquot Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I experienced what I would call a spiritual leading to take action to witness against the destruction of these old growth forests. I was 33 years old at the time. I asked for and received a clearness committee from my Quaker meeting, which helped me to discern the rightness of moving forward to risk arrest. As a person of faith, it was vitally important for me to know that I had the support of my spiritual community behind me in taking this action. And that continues to be very true today, as the actions that we have been taking recently have been very much in cooperation and partnership with other people. I traveled over to Vancouver Island and met up with my Quaker friend Muriel Sibley, who you can see in the lower right-hand corner of those photos. We were both arrested and charged with criminal contempt of court for defying an injunction granted by the courts to the logging company Macmillan Blodell, which banned protesting at MacBlow work sites. It was really important to me to go through that whole experience with Muriel, right from the arrest, right through to the court process and the sentencing. Again, that is such a long-standing Quaker tradition, dating back to the beginnings of Friends, traveling in the ministry to be working in pairs. Next slide. You can see in this photo that the Clayoquot Peace Camp was right in the middle of a clear cut, which we referred to as the Black Hole. Next slide. This is me being arrested. There were around 900 people arrested over the course of several months, and they used buses to haul us all off to the closest jail, which in this case was in Ucluelet. And they had to do mass trials to get us all processed through the courts, a process which took well over a year to complete. From a strategic point of view, I believe the most effective nonviolent civil disobedience actions seek to increase public support for the cause and to reduce social consent for the violence being inflicted. And I think in this case, the mass arrests at Clayoquot did have an effect on protecting certain areas of old growth forests at the time. But as we know, as we've seen recently in Fairy Creek, this struggle is one which is ongoing. Next slide. Fast forward to 2012, when Texas oil giant Kinder Morgan proposed to twin an existing pipeline from the Alberta tar sands to the Westridge Marine Terminal, the shipping terminal on Burrard Inlet in Burnaby, which is almost in my backyard. It's about 4 kilometers from where I live. So this is a good example of thinking globally and acting locally. In response to that, I co-founded a group called BROKE, Burnaby Residents Opposing Kinder Morgan Expansion, which is still active today. For nearly a decade since then, through my work with BROKE and in collaboration with many other groups, the effort to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline has been a central focus in my life. The project became the Trans Mountain Pipeline in May of 2018, when our federal government purchased the Kinder Morgan pipeline for $4.5 billion. So now we as taxpayers are all owners of this oil pipeline and expansion project. In that photo, you can see in the center is Kennedy Stewart, who is the current mayor of Vancouver. At the time that this was taken, he was our member of parliament for Burnaby North and was a real champion and leader in the effort to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Next. So BROKE has organized and collaborated in many creative actions, such as this die-in, to bring public attention to the risks posed by the pipeline, and especially by the tank farm oil storage facility located on Burnaby Mountain, at which they are currently building new storage tanks, which will triple the capacity of the very toxic diluted bitumen, which is stored there. And this is on the side of a mountain in an earthquake zone in the middle of a densely populated urban area in very close proximity to Simon Fraser University. Next. Just another slide from that same event. Next slide. One of the many, more than I can count, times that we've taken to the streets to bring attention to the pipeline and climate change. Next slide. One of the most important collaborations in this work has been with local Coast Salish peoples. This image shows myself and another member of BROKE in an honoring ceremony hosted by the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who have lived continuously on these lands since time immemorial, and whose name means people of the inlet. They have mounted numerous legal challenges to the pipeline, which threatens their title, rights, and interests. And as a settler on these lands, I can't stress enough how central the role that our Indigenous allies play in the land and water protection work that we do. We look to them for leadership, and we do our best to respect and follow appropriate protocols in everything we do. So yes, this was a blanketing ceremony. Next slide. My second arrest was in 2014 when Kinder Morgan, over the objections of the city of Burnaby and the community, proceeded with tree cutting and geotechnical drilling on Burnaby Mountain in preparation for pipeline construction. These protests really took on a life of their own, similar to the way that it was in Clayoquot Sound. It ignited an outpouring of public protest. And over 200 people were arrested and charged with civil contempt of court. But the charges were later dropped due to the injunction line being marked in the wrong place. Next slide. In March of 2018, a massive Indigenous-led march up Burnaby Mountain to the Trans Mountain tank farm began a summer of resistance in which hundreds of people were arrested. Next. It was on this day that the watch house was constructed on Burnaby Mountain, directly beside the Trans Mountain tank farm. In Coast Salish spirituality and culture, watch houses have been used since time immemorial to guard the territory from enemies. And this is a good example of that in the way that this project threatens the land and the air and the water, and the way of life and the culture of our Indigenous peoples. Next slide. speaking of creative actions, in July of that year, 7 Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists suspended themselves for 36 hours beneath the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge, the second narrowest bridge over Burrard Inlet, which effectively blocked tankers from moving in and out to the Trans Mountain Marine Terminal. Next slide. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the important role that affinity groups play in nonviolent direct action. So affinity groups are small autonomous groups formed around a shared interest or a common goal. They provide a method of organization that is flexible and decentralized and very lateral, not top-down. Next slide. Over the course of the summer of 2018, many different groups risked arrest, blocking the gates of the tank farm on Burnaby Mountain or the gates of the Westridge Marine Shipping Terminal. Typically, each action was organized by a different affinity group, such as people of faith, students, teachers, artists, etc. This particular slide shows an artist affinity group risking arrest. So affinity groups are an effective way to sustain resistance over a long period of time. In this case, probably about half a year. Next. Around this time, I was inspired to organize a prayerful vigil to risk arrest at the gates of the tank farm. Since all pipeline construction in our area at that point was confined to within the property lines of the tank farm or the marine terminal, going in and out of those facilities. At some point, we knew that pipeline construction would need to happen through more public areas of the city. So instead of doing what felt like a somewhat symbolic arrest action, blocking the gates, we decided to wait until such time as we could hopefully directly block construction in our community. So in July of 2018, I started the Earth Witness worship meeting. It was a multi-faith affinity group, including Quaker, Buddhist, Unitarian, United, Anglican, Presbyterian, Catholic, and people who were not affiliated with any faith group. We continued to meet monthly for about 2.5 years, almost always outside, even throughout the winter, and almost always at the watch house on Burnaby Mountain, which you can see just on the right side of that photo. Our meetings were inspired by Quaker protests, so we met in circles, grounded in silence, with an invitation for spoken ministry or song as people felt led. And meeting over that long period of time, kind of in preparation for hopefully doing direct action down the road, it really allowed us to develop a sense of community and mutual support. And we were all united in a desire to connect our faith with our climate justice and Indigenous solidarity work. Next slide. In August of 2020, a group called Protect the Planet, Stop TMX, or PPST, inspired by a member of our Vancouver Quaker meeting, created an aerial camp in the path of the pipeline at a place called Holmes Creek in Burnaby. Next. We maintained this tree sit for 6 weeks until mid-September, during what was called the least risk fish window, which was the period of time when TMX was required to complete certain work in the Brunette River corridor in order to cause the least harm to spawning salmon. Next. These were signs that were posted in the Brunette River corridor by the government. This is actually a sign that we had made, which was exactly the same shape, size, color as the original sign, except instead of saying, do not disturb or mow, it says, do not build pipelines. Next slide. In the months that followed, we built a substantial treehouse adjacent to the original aerial camp, which we affectionately nicknamed the Hilton. It was large enough to sleep several people, and it had various comforts of home, including carpeting and a composting toilet. But unfortunately, in early December of 2020, just as we were prepared to start occupying it full time, the treehouse was raided. Our camp was raided by the TMX security and RCMP and dismantled. Next slide. But not to be deterred, within a week, we established a new tree sit a short distance away at a place called Lost Creek in the same stretch of forest, the Brunette River corridor. And we succeeded in keeping this tree sit continuously occupied 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right through this past winter. This was no small feat, and it took a dedicated team of rotating climbers to spell each other off, and a large support team who brought food on a daily basis, were there to recharge batteries and do many other tasks. We actually succeeded in stopping Trans Mountain pipeline construction for almost 9 months by occupying trees such as this in the path of the pipeline that were slated to be cut down in Burnaby, by identifying active nests of hummingbirds and other birds in the path of the pipeline, which were protected by federal laws. And this actually stopped tree cutting for many months this past spring and summer. And also by holding interfaith prayer vigils to block pipeline construction. Next. So early in this process in 2021, it dawned on me that the time had come for the Earth Witness worship meeting to evolve into the Prayer Circle Direct Action Group, which was dedicated to taking spiritually rooted, peaceful direct action. Next. In March of 2021, the Prayer Circle did our first nonviolent civil disobedience action by blocking the vehicle gate at a Trans Mountain pipeline construction site very near the tree sit in Burnaby. Next. This is one of the signs that we use a lot, which kind of captures the sentiment. Next. And this is another occasion when the Prayer Circle blocked the vehicle gate, something we did on 3 separate occasions. And you can see the heavy equipment there on the right that we are preventing them from being able to move into the construction site. One of my learnings from this experience has been that getting arrested is not the point at all of nonviolent civil disobedience. It sometimes is what happens, but it's not the goal. It can be just as powerful to engage in an action and then choose to move when threatened with arrest. You can think of it in terms of arrest currency in a way, in the sense that nonviolent civil disobedience is a valuable right that we can choose to exercise. But as many of us are not inclined to engage in it repeatedly, since the consequences tend to ramp up steeply with repeated offenses, it makes sense to choose wisely when to actually use that arrest currency. Next. It's often possible to have a very strong impact, such as stopping work for hours or days without actually getting arrested. In my experience, the police will often go to great lengths to avoid arresting people, and they almost always give a lot of opportunity to walk away before being arrested. So we talk about risking arrest, meaning that we go into it knowing that there is the possibility, but often there is a choice too. And that actually has been a strategy which we have used a lot, because just next slide. Sometimes being arrested for defying an injunction will result in conditions like being required to stay possibly half a kilometer away from any work site. Avoiding arrest allows for the possibility of returning to be involved in more actions, which can be a big advantage strategically. So we want to be wise when, as I say, in choosing when to be arrested. Next slide. Whoops, sorry about that. And it's important to note that no matter what your level of comfort or discomfort with civil disobedience, there's always a role that you can play. Those of us willing to risk arrest need others who are willing to be present to witness and support, to act as police liaisons, jail support, to write press releases, talk to the media, take photographs and video and post to social media. Those are all like absolutely vital roles. Next. For 15 months, our group, PPST, succeeded in collaboration with many other groups and people. We succeeded in stopping or delaying Trans-Mountain tree cutting and construction. But in early September, there were signs that we were approaching the end game for this particular campaign. Next slide. One member of our prayer circle, Jeanette, who I think is with us tonight, was arrested on September 8th for defying the injunction and was charged with criminal contempt of court. Next slide. On the next day, on September 9th, I was arrested and also charged with criminal contempt of court. And because this injunction has been in effect for 3.5 years, and the severity of the sentences has been escalating in an attempt to deter people from protesting and protecting. What began as a $500 fine and community service is now 2 to 4 weeks in prison. So that's what those of us being arrested now are facing. Next slide. In late September, our tree sitters were forcibly removed by the RCMP and some were arrested. This is a tactical team of, we call them the green men, but they're the ones that are trained to climb trees and do difficult interventions to dismantle protests. Next slide. This is one of our tree sitters who heroically stayed up there in that hammock for about 10 days straight before being arrested. Next slide. This sign lists some of the various occupations and demographics of the people who are involved in the Protect the Planet group. The dedication and collective effort of so many people in this and other groups I'm involved with is what brings me hope and keeps me going when I feel discouraged. Especially when it feels like we've been working for so long, sometimes without seeing a lot of progress. It really helps me to remember that we can never underestimate the power of collective nonviolent direct action. We may not always be able to perceive the ripple effects that our actions may be having on members of the general public, on elected leaders, and those that we interact with in the law enforcement and in the legal system. My next court appearance will be in the Supreme Court of BC on February 14th in 2022, and it's likely that I'll be taken into custody at that time along with several others. Probably for a 14-day prison sentence. And I'll have an opportunity to make a statement to the court at that time, explaining my reasons for engaging in peaceful civil disobedience. And I'd like to close just by sharing the last part of my statement. Next slide. Many strong and courageous people have walked this path before me. They too have stood before the National Energy Board, the ministerial panel, and courts of law, and brought overwhelming scientific evidence that demonstrates the dangers and folly of proceeding with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. The evidence is available for anyone who wishes to look. My decision to engage in peaceful civil disobedience is a deeply personal one. It is one which is motivated by my love for creation and concern for the future of my children and life on Earth. I am witnessing to the truth that Earth is a finite planet with a limited capacity to sustain life. I have learned that life on Earth involves a reciprocal relationship, and we have forgotten how to pay attention to taking care of that balance. I am just one person, but I know that I am part of a much larger tide, and I believe that tide is turning. That we cannot continue on the course we are currently on is obvious, and yet the system remains in place which allows it to continue. Enough is enough. Too much has already been lost. Let us see what love can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That is a really powerful way to connect these ideas and philosophies and tactics and strategies that Rivera opened up to a kind of particular campaign and go deep, and also show us how it connects to Quakerism and faith, right? So that's, thank you very much for that. And I will now pass it to Rachel, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Rivera and Ruth for sharing so personally and so honestly and so thoughtfully about what your extensive experience and stuff that you can really only learn through experience. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. My name is Rachel. I'm the Canada organizer at World Beyond War. I'll just quickly say that we're a global movement to abolish war and establish a just and sustainable peace. We've got over 20 chapters all around the world, members in over 192 countries. And I'm excited to also be here tonight speaking on behalf of the No Fighter Jets Coalition, which I'll get to in a second. But first, I do want to come back to talking about what's happening right now this evening. I was extremely fortunate to spend the last 2 weeks actually on Wet'suwet'en land, supporting their land defense. Maybe I'll just give a very brief amount of context for folks who might not be quite as familiar with this struggle. On one hand, this is a struggle of many centuries fighting colonization, but at a smaller lens, about a month ago or a month and a half ago now, at the end of September, Wet'suwet'en members of CASIC and their supporters shut down Coastal GasLink's drill site, which is on their own Wet'suwet'en territories. And what's more, the drill site at that exact moment was trying to drill under the banks of their sacred Wet'suwet'en River at the center of their life, where their salmon flows, a river that is so pristine that I had the great honor of being able to stick a glass in it and drink from it. So at the end of September, they set up a camp which had completely halted any work on the pipeline. And of course, earlier waves of this resistance, as they've fought over a dozen pipelines on their territory, have been met by appalling state violence, militarized invasions. And Wet'suwet'en leaders understand this state violence as an ongoing colonial war, as a genocidal project that Canada has been perpetrating for over 150 years. And we know that the foundations of Canada are a colonial war that has always served to remove Indigenous people from their land for resource extraction. So that's what we see happening right now on Wet'suwet'en territory. And for myself, certainly as a staff organizer at World Beyond War, but also as a settler on stolen Indigenous land, if I'm serious about war abolition, if I'm serious about stopping state violence and militarism, about advocating and working for peace, I know for me that means intervening directly in these militarized invasions, in what is happening right now on Wet'suwet'en land. And maybe I'll say even more personally, as a parent to a 4-year-old, I think constantly about what defense of this planet looks like. And frankly, standing alongside the Wet'suwet'en people to stop this pipeline is the best way I know to fight for a livable planet for my kid, for future generations. And that's maybe more context than we need, but for what's happening right today, which is the RCMP have invaded Wet'suwet'en territory. Dozens of heavily armed police officers have breached Gidimt'en checkpoints, which for context are places where people are living on their own land and living in these beautiful supportive communities. I know Rivera mentioned sort of prefigurative politics. How can our resistance reflect the world that we want to live in? That's what I saw there every single day. And it's frankly heartbreaking for me right now to imagine and to know what's happening. Over 15 people have been arrested this evening. This is unfortunately probably just the start of the RCMP invasion that's happening there right now. And I know that all across so-called Canada, people are going to rise up in resistance to this. Here in Toronto, for anyone else who's here with us or with me in the city, we are having an emergency rally tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. at 150 Wellington West, and we are going to Wellington Street West, and we are going to directly confront the owners and funders of this pipeline. I know that, yeah, if you look up Wet'suwet'en solidarity in your city, all across Canada, I'm certain within a few days, there will be solidarity actions popping up. And if there isn't, then you should plan one, because solidarity at this moment is incredibly key. And if the Shutdown Canada movement showed us anything last year, it's how powerful we can all be together, and how these war crimes are happening, maybe not exactly where we live, but the infrastructure that supports them goes right through basically all of our backyards. And so we all do have that power where we live. So what I saw on Wet'suwet'en land was what I would consider, and what folks there consider, defense of territory, defense of each other, defense of their communities, of their ancestors, but also of many generations to come, of the water, of all living creatures. And it was a defense that was really rooted in responsibility, in deep care, in love. It was extremely obvious. Maybe now it's time for me to flip to what the Canadian government refers to as defense. I think I better put it in quotes. I was invited to speak tonight on behalf of the No Fighter Jets Coalition, which is a relatively new coalition of individuals and organizations all across so-called Canada who have come together to stop the Canadian government's biggest defense project right now, or so they call it, which is the planned purchase of 88 new bomber planes for an estimated $77 billion. So this coalition is determined to stop the purchase of the next generation of these horrific weapons of war before the Canadian government can make it happen. To quickly introduce what these jets are about, they're designed to do the exact same thing that Canada's last batch of fighter jets did, CF-18s, which is to carry bombs and missiles that will kill civilians, disproportionately children, is the historic fact, that will destroy critical infrastructure that over the past several decades has left millions without safe drinking water, without electricity. And this time, this new generation of fighter jets would have the added, utterly terrifying capacity to carry and launch nuclear weapons. So Canada's current stock of fighter jets has spent the last few decades bombing Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, in all cases prolonging violent conflict, causing enormous humanitarian and refugee crises. And frankly, these operations have had nothing to do with defense or ensuring any kind of security for Canada. So that's the context for the No Fighter Jets campaign. And I'm going to just show a few slides to share a little bit of what this campaign has actually looked like on the ground. How's that looking? Great. So we have been coming together as small little groups all across the country, targeting our members of parliament, holding regular rallies. And I wanted to start with some of these photos because, in fact, this coming week, starting on Monday, so from this Monday, November 22nd to the 26th, is a Canada-wide week of action against the fighter jets. And for this week of action, what we are asking people to do is to show up at their member of parliament's office and to make it extremely clear that we oppose the purchase of these fighter jets. They're not about protecting us, and that we won't let them make this sort of a quiet purchase they approve on a Friday night before a holiday, which, to be honest, looks like what they're hoping to do. So we've been, of course, bringing the message to Ottawa, to Parliament Hill as well. This is near a army base in Halifax. And then we've been, just to show some of the other tactics that we've used, we've been digging deep into research. The Canadian government has been talking about this as a 19 billion purchase. Of course, that's just the sticker price. It doesn't include anything to actually run these jets, to even to get them set up so that pilots could conceivably fly them. So what we've done is launched a report that demonstrated that it's in fact $77 billion is the true cost of these jets. We launched a fast to stop the jets. This is, you know what, I'll come back to this slide in a sec. This is a great example of how one person can spark something that can then be taken up by people all over the place. Brendan Martin, our World Beyond War Vancouver chapter member, decided that he was going to hold a fast to highlight the humanitarian crises that these bombings do cause, and specifically focusing on certain areas where there has been famine as a result of these war missions. And his fast got a ton of media coverage for starters, but also sparked a countrywide fast. And here you see just a small number of the hundreds of people who ended up joining him where they were. This was sort of in the really thick of lockdowns in the pandemic, so it was harder to gather publicly, but everyone in their own home could fast and could share that, similar to some of the examples that were shared earlier today. Right now, I want to encourage everyone after this webinar to visit our website. This is what it'll look like when you go there, nofighterjets.ca. If you'd like to click the Act Now button, it will take you to just a simple email tool. Great place to start. Escalate from there, where you can email your MP and tell them that you oppose these jets. But also, if you click on that top right corner there, I'm not sure if you can see it, where it says Week of Action, you'll find the list of, we've got dozens of actions planned for this coming week all across the country. In this case, this week, a lot of them are smaller rallies outside of MP's offices, but some of us are also going to be taking this corrected Lockheed Martin ad. So this is started as a Lockheed Martin ad that they are promoting extremely heavily to members of parliament and all over Ottawa. And we have corrected it to make it factual. And we're going to be taking some giant versions of these about, you can't see my hands, probably about like 6 feet wide by maybe 4 feet tall, and putting them up in strategic places outside of the Deputy Prime Minister's office, for example, here in Toronto, the Defense Minister, and maybe some other secret places as well. So that's a kind of fun, directly counter. We can never compete with Lockheed Martin's tens of millions of dollars in advertising, but we can strategically intervene in it. I also just wanted to maybe give a plug that World Beyond War has been doing a ton of workshops and resources recently about how to prepare for arrest, how to plan a direct action, what are the ways to be strategic in your campaigning. We have a bunch of organizing 101 free courses. So for those who are hungry for more knowledge about that, we have a lot that we would love to share, and that is all available for free. I think that's it for me for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Wow, so much passion from these three speakers and so much knowledge as well. Amazing. I hope that this session has inspired you to take some actions, but I also hope that you have some questions for any of our speakers. So please do type into the Q&A if you have questions. I see there's one in there now, and it looks like maybe start with Ruth. So Ruth, in your experience, how easy is it to discern how long you can defy orders to move before being arrested?
Right, yeah. I don't think there's any one simple answer to that. In most of the situations that I've been with these resource extraction projects, usually a corporation will apply for an injunction in order to be able to remove protesters or get the RCMP to remove protesters. So that was true at Clayoquot, and it's certainly been true here with Trans Mountain. So with the injunction that we've been dealing with here with Trans Mountain, the judge indicated that there needed to be a 5-step process for arresting people. So they had to, tell you that you were in an illegal position. They had to ask you to leave. And then they had to read the injunction or have it projected over a loudspeaker. And they had to very clearly go through these 5 steps, or they were supposed to before. So at any point during that time, they would ask you to leave. You had the option to get up and leave. But on the other hand, they haven't been applying this equally across the board. So unfortunately, something that those of us that have been involved in this movement for a while have seen is that Indigenous people, people of color, are treated differently than more privileged people or people who are not Indigenous. So there have been situations where Indigenous people have been arrested without having, the RCMP going through that process. So there's no simple answer, but the best rule of thumb is that if you are going into a situation like that, you need to be prepared for the possibility that you will be arrested. But most likely, in most situations, you will have the option to leave without being arrested. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Rivera, maybe this one's for you to start with. Someone is asking about theory of change. And if you could say more about maybe viable theories of change or kind of the most effective theories of change that you're aware of, or something like, because many of these actions that you highlighted, it seems like some were successful and some weren't obviously successful. So more about theory of change and how that relates to success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a theory of change can be a number of things, right? From if we just shout loud enough, change will happen, to, some people's theory of change is if we just pray to God and God hears us, the miracle will occur. And then there's a whole range of other things in there, like, billionaires make change happen. For example, those of us who work with nonviolent action tend to believe actually that people power makes change happen. The theory that I specifically work a lot with comes from Gene Sharp and his theory of change that's rooted in what he called the pillars of support. To me, it's very much related to systems theory, to things like ecosystems, and it's the idea that a power holder or problem doesn't exist all on its own, right? If a dictator wants to make something happen, they don't just magically snap their fingers and suddenly they built a palace, right? They have to give an order. The order has to get delivered. The police have to go round up the workers have to go and pick up the tools, and then they have to build the palace. If at any point one of those groups refuses to cooperate with the dictator can kill them, but he can't get his palace built, right? In our case, it's often much more something like the power holder can arrest us, but he can't get us to do X, Y, or Z. We see this a lot with workers who go on strike. The boss can fire them all, but that doesn't mean he's not going to get his factory back to work. So by withdrawing your cooperation and consent, by pulling out those pillars of support that prop up a problem or injustice, that problem or injustice falls, it collapses out of power, more or less gracefully. There's some nuances to that equation, some of which we want to be in charge of. We want to create the alternative systems. We want to pull those resources out of the problem and put them into the solution. And what I see is that actually a lot of successful campaigns influence those pillars of support to the degree that even if the system doesn't collapse, the position of the power holder becomes tenuous and shaky. They must respond to the removal of support by the activist group, or they can't continue what they're doing. We do know from Erica and Maria's study on the efficacy of nonviolent struggle that any group that is successfully mobilized 3.5% of the population has always won their struggle, always. But there is a catch to that number, isn't there always? It's not 3.5% of the populace engaged in acts of protest and persuasion. They have to be engaged in acts of non-cooperation and intervention. And this is really important because those two kinds of nonviolent actions move those pillars of support. They cause that disruption we were talking about earlier. So if we want to be successful, we have to gear our actions to such a degree that they make an impact on the system that we're trying to change. I hope that was helpful. We could do a whole deep dive on theories of change, but that's the one I like to work with.
Thank you. We have a question here, or sorry, does anybody else want to say anything on theory of change before I go to the next question?
I think Rivera covered it very well.
You okay, Rachel? Okay. How important is mainstream media coverage in these campaigns, given how often it seems they're indifferent to nonviolent direct action or choose for whatever reason to withhold coverage?
I guess the simple answer is I think it is really critical in terms of getting the word out and in terms of influencing public opinion and reducing social consent for the violence and the harm that's being done. I think it's really important. In our experience with the campaign we've had here in Burnaby, I think we experienced what we would have considered a media blackout for quite a long time. We really had to work really hard to get the mainstream media to actually cover what we were doing. It was easier to get the alternative media out to cover it, and that was very helpful. Even our local papers like the Burnaby Now and that are strong allies. They're very, very good at coming out and covering everything we're doing. But yeah, we've had quite a few rallies in front of the CBC office here in Vancouver to try to pressure them to start covering climate change and covering what's going on. It seems like it takes one thing we've learned is that it really does take arrests, and it takes like they really don't want to come out at all unless there is our visuals and like we've had them come out and there are people, there's a tree sit going on and to us, it's like very dramatic what's going on, but there's like, oh, nobody's getting arrested, so we're just going to go home. They need it to be dramatic in order to get to be newsworthy, I guess. So it's something that we have to work hard to get that media coverage. I think it's important.
I think for me, I would add, I definitely agree with everything Ruth said, But also for me, not every action, not every aspect of a campaign is about media coverage. Like some things, if that's the goal, then you really work towards that goal, but not every action has to be about that. In some cases, when you are blocking trains, like the goal might be to block the trains, to not allow a weapon to pass through a certain area, or to not allow to interrupt the infrastructure because that fundamentally disrupts something. And then sometimes you're also happy with the media coverage, but sometimes it's not necessary. In some cases, you really are doing very secret actions and you don't want the actor known. You don't want there to be criminal repercussions or so forth. And you don't necessarily want media coverage, but you want what you've done to be effective. In other cases, in my organizing with the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, we do tons of work directly working in solidarity with communities around the world who've been harmed by Canadian mining companies. Sometimes some of the things we do are about just directly showing up for them and what they want, or doing something that feels directly strategic to them. So maybe we go to a corporate annual general meeting on their behalf, and we hand directly into the hands of the CEO photos of people who have died in their community or have been killed while resisting mining. The media is not the goal there. The goal might be, because that's emotionally important for them, and also it might be part of a legal strategy, the CEO can never later say in a court, oh, I didn't know this was happening, because we have documented evidence that actually we crashed your shareholder meeting and we put that document in your hand. The media is irrelevant in that case. So I think sometimes it's good to just think, if we can only achieve one thing with this particular action, what is most important to us? And if it's media, then as Ruth said, we better pull out all those bells and whistles and make it appealing to them. But if it's not, then it's not a loss if we don't get coverage.
Yeah, just to build on what Ruth and Rachel are so excellently saying, remember that media in all its forms, whether it's mainstream media, alternative media, activist media, social media, it's a tactic to achieve the goal of your strategy, right? A strategy and a tactic to achieve the goal. And so when we're thinking about mainstream media, like dig deeper. What is the goal? The goal is often to reach far beyond the choir of the people who already agree with you. And if the mainstream media isn't doing that, how else can you get there? Is there a church mailing list? Right? Is it the Boys and Girls Club can put up a banner? Is it that the marquee of the local school can put up something, right? So if the goal is to reach those people who are not already in your movement, there may be other tactics that can also help you do that if you're experiencing a media blockade.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a question. In England, I know Extinction Rebellion has encountered objections which call it a classist approach, whereby those who are free of limited jobs block poor workers from earning money by getting to work. What do the amazingly great panelists say about this?
I think there's truth in that. And I think that Extinction Rebellion, who I have respect for, is predominantly a white, probably middle-class organization. At least most of the activists are predominantly in that demographic. And I think that it has been a real learning experience to see how the campaign does affect more marginalized people. So I think that it's a valid point.
Yeah, there was a particular action that Extinction Rebellion did that involved a subway line, I believe, that got a lot of flack on that note. And it was a well-deserved critique of that action. And then I think we need to be careful of doing is falling into the trap of the power holders of being not specific about that critique, right? And just saying, oh, Extinction Rebellion, they're so classist, right? That's actually a line being used by power holders who don't want to make change to discredit a lot of other really great, amazing work that's going on. So we got to live in these nuances, and we got to be skillful and informed about what we're seeing and observing. All of that aside, with Extinction Rebellion, the key takeaway for any of us strategically is you want the impact of your actions to be felt as closely to the power holder or the problem makers as possible, and to be felt as little as possible on everybody else, right? So if your target, you may have a campaign where your target is to get a particular ally group to move into action. Be targeted about that, right? If you're like, I want the white upper class liberals to suddenly get involved in this struggle, think about what's going to motivate them to come into the struggle, not what's going to alienate them, right? Don't go blocking the highway that, from the less affluent end of town in order to get their attention, because they're using the other highway, right? So be skillful, be strategic. This is why instead of sometimes you need to use a little tiny microscopic screwdriver versus a sledgehammer, right? And this is why strategy is so important, is because you can think these things through and make wise decisions.
Yeah, I was just wanted to jump in again, just because I have really struggled with the tactic that is most often used by Extinction Rebellion to block traffic and to block bridges. And I've participated in them. I'm not saying, I do participate in them, but at the same time, I do struggle with it. However, there's just a couple thoughts about that. And one is that, it wasn't until Extinction Rebellion on the day before COP started, they blocked the main road to the Vancouver airport. And I believe that Extinction Rebellion groups across Canada did that. They called it shutting down the airport. I don't think they quite shut down the airport, but they did shut down a major road to the airport. And that was what cracked the media blackout. There was a bunch of people arrested. And I think that the idea is that we are in this climate emergency and it's not getting the attention it needs. And sometimes it takes a huge amount of disruption in order to get the attention of decision makers. And so from that point of view, I can see the sense in doing that. Let's see what else. I was going to say something else about that. Yeah, I forgot what else I was going to say, but yeah. Anyway, that's it's a difficult thing to come to terms with. I know what I was going to say. That the whole civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, it was very unpopular, just like Extinction Rebellion. It's not popular to disrupt business as usual. People aren't going to like it. And sometimes, I think it is what we need to do. And I actually really do believe that this kind of disruption and civil resistance, it's critical right now. And I really hope that the people that are listening tonight, we may be preaching to the choir, but I can't say strongly enough how much I believe that that's what we need to be doing right now. Thanks.
And I'm not in BC right now, Ruth is, so maybe I shouldn't speak to what resonates, but at least from outside BC looking now, it's hard to, from my perspective, would you rather your highway blocked for several hours, or would you rather a summer of wildfires and now highways completely wiped out by flooding? It feels at a certain point like you can't disrupt the capitalist society we live in a way that only targets those in power. It's very, very hard. When we can be pinpointed, we should be, but at a certain point, it's hard to not inconvenience anyone else. And I think sometimes the inconvenience is the point and is important. And what we're up against is going to be so much more disruptive if we don't resist it than any disruption we're causing right now. It just pales in comparison. I also think that and I've seen this especially with the Canadian extractive industry. They are an absolute expert at dividing the left, at turning us against each other, at inserting these narratives of undermining this, or this person's tactic is evil and this and that. And it's important for us to be critical in our movements, but at the same time, we should be careful who we're tearing down because they've chosen a tactic that maybe isn't what we would have chosen, especially with brand new groups or groups who are just getting started. Like, how can we support each other in deepening our analysis and skills versus only condemning each other?
Thank you. There's a question about comics and the use of comics to engage young people, multiple people with different languages, or semi-literate people.
Yes, why not? I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've just seen so much creativity and versatility in terms of popular education, from things like street murals to banners to teach-ins, like verbal teach-ins, to giant puppet shows and street theater. And I would say, yes, comics can play a wonderful role. There's a couple out there on Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. Martin Luther, John Lewis, I think, is the one I'm thinking of. And a few more. There's one on Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. But in my opinion, like, why isn't the entire comic industry like just full of all the incredible heroic struggles of nonviolent action? Why isn't there one out already about Wet, Sweat, and Struggle, or the struggle to stop the TMX pipeline? You know, these are the heroes of our times, and they're well poised to be the central figures of this kind of media, which is slightly different from what the question was, which is about using it as a tool of specifically training and education around nonviolent action, which I think is a great idea.
Okay, what do any of the panel think of people's assemblies as an effective tool in these tumultuous times? Is there a good time to have these people's assemblies?
I think people's assemblies are really useful. We've had several of them. During COVID, we've been having them on Zoom, which actually has been fairly effective. And we've especially found it useful to have breakout groups and be able to have facilitators in breakout groups and to use that as a tool for expanding our movement and getting more people involved and disseminating information. So, I mean, before COVID, we had people's assemblies in person. And yeah, I mean, it's a great way to expand awareness and disseminate information and get people involved.
Maybe I'll just say on that, I think like any tactic, the tactic has to match the goal. And with some campaigns, like communities discussing it over and over actually isn't going to get you where you need to go. In other places, that absolutely needs to be the first step because people aren't on the same page at all. So I think anytime we sort of fall in love with a tactic, we have to force ourselves to be sort of critical with every campaign, with every step. Like, is this actually the right fit for what's needed right now? And if so, yes. But if not, I think I've seen some projects get sort of sidelined, to be honest, into people's assemblies. And it's like, actually, we need to start taking action right now. We're beyond the point where it's useful for us to like keep getting the perfect manifesto together. Like, actually, we're enough on the same page to move forward. So that's one critique I have because I've seen it, but that was just what that situation demanded.
Ruth, can you give us a brief sense of where the TMX campaign is at right now, what might be coming soon, and how the flooding shapes that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've observed about this and other one of these extractive projects is that there tends to be, the narrative is that it's a done deal and there's no point in, resistance is futile. So we need to kind of like just resist that, you know, and realize that it's not futile. It's like I said earlier, we have to have faith that the resistance that we're engaged in is having an effect, even if we can't always see exactly what it is at the time, that we can't always see the effect that we're having. Yeah, every delay that happens is a victory. And, you know, the more into this climate emergency we get, and the further down the road we go, it makes less and less sense all the time to go ahead with it. And so the flooding is another delay. There's actually been, I have to look a little more into it, but I think I know that the pipeline is shut down because of the flooding. And I think that the construction has been disrupted. I'm not sure whether, I think there are sections of the pipeline which have been washed out. So as much as that is concerning, I mean, every time that there is a delay, it feels like a victory. So I think that this is not good news for the pipeline, that this disaster has happened. In terms of what might be happening soon, well, it's a little bit hard to say, but there are an awful lot of strong voices that are speaking out from an economic point of view, from an environmental point of view, from so many points of view to have it canceled. So I guess we just have to, and yeah, and you know, there's so many different diversities of tactics, and here we are on the front lines, and there's so many other people that are working on it from an economic point of view and other Indigenous point of view. So we just have to all keep working at it from wherever we are working from, and hope that collectively we will be able to stop it.
Can I say something about the sort of the value of the delay? I was really enthralled with a new climate report that came out in August that demonstrated a number of things, including just like the horrific violence that land defenders have faced, but also demonstrated that Indigenous-led resistance on Turtle Island has, through stopping pipelines or delaying many pipelines, has basically delayed greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to at least a quarter of annual US and Canadian emissions. So at least 25% of annual emissions in Canada and the US have been prevented by Indigenous-led resistance to pipelines, to other fossil fuel projects. That's humongous. And we may want sort of every single one of those pipelines to ultimately be canceled, but even the delay over many years has made like far and away the largest impact in a positive way on the climate crisis. So I think that sometimes a delay is not the victory we want, but the ultimate collective cumulative impact on the planet can be enormous.
Thank you. How much do you think a focus on corporations now is more strategic than on governments?
I think it depends. Well, it depends on the issue you're talking about, and it also depends a little bit on the nature of your government. I speak to you from the US. I didn't do a land acknowledgement before. I should do that just really briefly, that I'm on the land of the Taos Pueblo and the Tiwa people, what we call New Mexico in what we now call the United States. So I just want to answer this question from the US perspective, that we know from studies that have been done that the US government, federal government, does not actually enact the will of the people. It literally on 2000 climate public policy issues over a 20-year period, we the people got our way 0.0% of the time on those public policy issues. Who did get their way were rich people and businesses. And if it looked like we were getting something, it was because one of those two groups wanted them. So that said, in the US at least, and I'll let my Canadian counterparts answer for Canada, it is really important to put the pressure on the corporations. Many of them are much more vulnerable than governments to popular pressure. particularly to the immediate impacts of negative press. You know, in the US, like, what are you going to do? Vote them out after 4 years? For a company, they're going to be watching their quarterly reports. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in making sure you're targeting them. When we're talking about pipelines and climate issues, it's not just about the fossil fuel companies, it's also about the banks and the insurers. Those are like some very vulnerable pieces of the equation that they need, that are getting a lot of focus and pressure right now, which is important. But I think Rachel said something really wise. And I think Ruth also said it in another way, that it's not necessarily just a one strategy fits all system, you know, like if they are a many-headed hydra, we have the numbers to win at this game. I mean, just remember that we've got millions and millions of people we can call upon. So if we need to go after the banks, the insurance, the government, the local Boys and Girls Club, whatever it is, you know, we have the versatility to do a multi-pronged approach. And especially if we make space in our movements for various hubs and groups to do where their passion and their strategy leads them. And I think just getting out of this silver bullet solution, or out of this, you know, one right answer, or even one big union mentality, and really thinking about swarms, about the versatility of large groups of complex people and movements, and being willing to live in that kind of glorious madness is actually a superpower on our side, if we can work with it.
I guess the only thing I was going to say is that, you know, when the Trans Mountain Pipeline was owned by Kinder Morgan, which was a Texas oil giant, it was, you know, it was a very different situation than after it was purchased by the Canadian government. And in some ways, it was easier to fight it when it was the Texas oil giant. And now when it's the Canadian government, it's a completely different optic. But in a sense, we have the advantage in the sense that we are now the owners of the pipeline as taxpayers. So we do have some leverage in that regard, although it is definitely a struggle. Sorry, just wanted to make that little observation.
Does direct action have more impact on increasing public education than actually stopping projects? So is there evidence of direct action being able to stop power brokers?
Well, maybe I'll start by just saying, yeah, in Wet'suwet'en territory, like there's been 12 pipelines that have attempted to go through there over a decade, and like none have. Like their direct action of just, yeah, constantly putting their bodies in the way of these projects has absolutely worked. And yes, the Coastal GasLink is trying to build through now, but they're going to stop that one too. So I think, I mean, if we're trying to say, is something stopped forever? I mean, then we're sort of talking about like the end of capitalism. Like maybe nothing is fully stopped forever, so long as we live within a broken system. But there's been so many victories.
Yeah, I would just say that from my vantage point on studying the immense canon of nonviolent struggle, yes, absolutely, direct action has got, there's even a phrase, direct action gets the goods, because it is incredibly effective. And one of the things, I put the link to Nonviolence News in the chat box, one of the things that I see collecting 30 to 50 stories of nonviolence in action each week is that we are, those of us who work for justice using these tools, we are missing our success rate. Oh my goodness. Every week I have 6 to 12 stories of things that have gone right for movements or advances for social justice, many of which did come from direct action or from other kinds of organizing that may not be direct action, but are related nonviolent actions. So yeah, I think we're kind of missing our strength and how successful we're being. I mean, it can be hard to believe when we're in the middle of so many struggles, when we're up against so many crises, but I like to remember these things because they keep me going, honestly. It'd be really hard to be like, yes, let's use nonviolent action, if you couldn't like hang your hat on it and be like, you know, we reshaped the course of the end of the 20th century with nonviolent action. The Soviet bloc fell because of nonviolent struggles for independence. The civil rights movement dismantled segregation in the South. Suffrage in the US, I don't know about Canada, Great Britain were largely won by direct action, suffrage for women. You know, the plan to roll out thousands and thousands of nuclear power plants, especially when they didn't know anything about the toxicity of them, was stopped. Nuclear bombing, a test bombing above ground, was stopped by nonviolent direct action. I could actually go on until you're really tired of me telling you all these things. But in my opinion, as someone who's not quite 40 years old, the shape of my life has been largely formed by nonviolent direct action of those who have come before me. The shape of the world for the positive that I live in is the direct result of the people who have waged struggle using these tools.
Wonderful. I think that's a great note to close on. I thank all of you very much for being here. I thought this was really informative and inspiring, and I hope that our audience feels that way too. And so with that, thanks everyone for taking part, and have a great evening.